Hey students, and welcome to Week 8 Notes. This is for AP European History, and this week we're going to focus on the topic of absolute monarchs, and we're going to focus on constitutionalism. And what we want to do this week is we want to see a transition from feudal monarchs during the Middle Ages and medieval times to new monarchs during the Renaissance and that era of exploration, as monarchs start to centralize their power and take the power away from the other nobles and centralize that power, and also stop sharing power with the Catholic Church in a lot of cases. So that's going to be these new monarchs. And pretty soon we're going to see these monarchs who develop what we call absolutism, or they become absolutely in control of their country. We're also going to see a case study, particularly with Great Britain. The United Kingdom of Great Britain is going to form, and we're going to see it transition from these feudal monarchs to these new monarchs, to these absolute monarchs, and eventually into what we call constitutionalism, where the monarch doesn't have absolute control, but we start to see a sharing of power between the monarch and the other nobility. So almost coming full circle, eventually, these constitutional monarchies are going to end up sharing power with the people. And that's going to happen a lot later than we're going to be talking about. But that's kind of the general trend that we're going to be talking about here during Week 8, absolutism and constitutionalism, monarchs of Europe. I'm going to focus, like this essential question says, what can we learn by comparing absolute monarchs of France with the constitutional monarchies of England? And we're going to try to follow the development in both of these countries and use them as like case studies for the rest of Europe, because there's monarchs across the continent of Europe, especially during this time period. From new monarchies to absolutism to constitutionalism. That's kind of the first main idea, and it's what I just said. Again, I'm going to repeat this again. In the 14 and 1500s, a new type of monarch evolved from the decentralized structure of feudalism during the Middle Ages to a centralized structure of power. So what I said on the title slide just a second ago, I'm going to repeat again. During the Middle Ages, during medieval times, during the Dark Ages, what we tend to see are these monarchs who don't have absolute control over their country. They have to share power with other nobles and lords, right? These aristocrats, right? The aristocracy. So the king himself only has as much power as the lords or nobles share with him. So the king the king technically owns all the land in a feudal system, and he gives land in order to get loyalty back. So it's a trade-off right there. And the king shares power with the other lords and nobles. That's what a feudal system looks like. There is a king, and the king is at the top, but he doesn't have absolute control over everything. The local lords, the local landlords, which is interesting, that's a word we still use in modern times that's left over from the Dark Ages. If you live in Apple Valley and you pay rent to somebody that you don't actually own the land, but you pay rent, you still call them a landlord. So we still use some of these like medieval terminologies right here before. And we definitely don't live in a feudal system, but in the United States right now, we do use a system called federalism. And that's the sharing of power between the states and the federal government. It's kind of like feudalism in that the king didn't have all power. He had to share it with the local lords that controlled the land where if you were a peasant or a regular person, a serf living on the land, you would answer to the local lord. And then that lord would swear fealty to like having a fief, right? A piece of land gifted by the king. And so that kind of sets the stage in this class, right? We're starting in 1450 and moving forward in this class. But that's what I want to show you is this evolution of change, how monarchies went from sharing power with local lords and not being totally in control to finally centralizing, pulling some of that control away from the local lords so that they were more powerful and could raise more taxes. And then we even see some of these nobles are going to disconnect from the Catholic Church during the Reformation, during the 1500s. These kings are going to sever ties with Rome, the Catholic Church, and that way they can control not just the political things, but also the religious things in their country. And by the time they control all of the politics, and they're not sharing power with the nobles, and they're also not sharing power with the Catholic Church, because they're making their own churches, or at least they're not requiring people to be Roman Catholic in their country, then they're starting to turn into these absolute monarchs. And then we're also going to see a case study where this absolute monarchy falls apart, especially in the United Kingdom and Great Britain, and it's going to turn into constitutionalism. So hopefully that kind of paints a picture of where we're going today. So these new monarchs that were starting during the 1500s raised taxes to fund professional armies. And they implemented new military technology, like gunpowder started to become a thing, and that was changing how warfare was fought. And they put into place complex bureaucracies to consolidate power. If you've ever heard of a bureaucracy or a bureaucrat, that's a professional government worker. And so these new monarchies were starting to control more of the government and share less with the other royal families within their kingdoms. And obviously some of the other royal families didn't like this, and we see some civil wars break out, sometimes under the disguise of religious conflicts, like the French Wars of Religion. It was definitely a religious conflict, but it was also a struggle for which family in France was going to control the throne. Okay, so some of those things, they start out religious, but there's also a huge political motivation underneath. French kings are a good example of an absolute monarchy, a ruler with absolute authority over the government and the people. So again, I hope you can see that transition. I like that word evolved that I used in the first right here, how monarchies evolved, right, over time. Over time, the English kings will transition from an absolute monarchy to what we call a constitutional monarchy, where they're going to share power with a legislative body called Parliament. Now, eventually, the people of Great Britain are going to influence Parliament, and so it's going to become a sort of democracy, if you will. Like if you go to the United Kingdom today, they still have a Queen of England, right? The Queen of the United Kingdom. But they also have a parliament and a prime minister who kind of functions like a sort of president of Great Britain. And so they have democracy and voting, even though they still have a king or a queen. And so that we're going to see a transition there in Great Britain. Whereas because France just doesn't give up on their absolute monarchy program, we're going to see the French Revolution. But that's another lecture quite a ways, a month away. Okay, but that's the problem that's going to happen is France doesn't give in, and the people don't get any kind of power or say or democracy until they hit a breaking point. And that's going to snap at the end of the 1700s, 1789, with the first French Revolution. Okay, but that's up and coming. Right now, we're going to focus more on how these monarchies developed during the 14 and 1500s. And then by the time we hit the 1600s and 1700s, they're into the absolute monarch phase. If you don't know what a constitution is, in the United States, we have a document, a piece of paper, a large piece of paper that has 7 articles. And by the year 2020, it has 27 amendments, is a piece of paper that limits the power of government. So any constitution you talk about in any country is just that. It's a document that limits the power of government. Sometimes people look back in history, at least in English history, to the Magna Carta during the 1200s, during medieval times, where the Parliament, that is a group of nobles, that's what Parliament started out as, a group of nobles, royalty, who were asking the king, demanding the king to make sure that if he raised taxes, they were included in that process. And today, Parliament has a House of Lords and a House of Commons, just like it kind of sounds like. The House of Lords is built off the old idea of royalty and nobility, and the House of Commons is those common people who had a little bit of money and influence and who were able to help make king and sign off on, help make the king, help make laws and rules. Sometimes the parliament is more powerful than the king, but technically in English history, in the government and how it functions in England, Parliament serves at the behest of the king or queen. But still, if you look at modern politics, they kind of control everything. And today, the king or queen just kind of signs off whatever Parliament does. They might not like it how I say it, but that's really how it functions. So a constitution is a document that limits the powers of government if it is backed by authority and the people believe in its legitimacy. So that's where we're heading. This is kind of just an overview of what we're going to do. We're going to move into the second time period now. The first couple units of this class, Unit 1 and Unit 2, we focused on Unit 1, the Renaissance and exploration from 1450 to 1648. And then with Unit 2, we focused on the Reformation, the age of religious conflict in Europe, again, from 1450 to 1648. Now, with this unit, we're kind of moving into unit number 3, absolutism and constitutionalism, and we're going to pick it up in 1648 at the end of the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia, and we're going to move all the way up during this time period up to the French Revolution and Napoleon, right, up until 1815 when Napoleon loses power. So this right here, we're looking at a map of Europe in 1648. You can see in red, not red like this, that's the, those are Habsburg lands right there. But this red line right here is showing the old Holy Roman Empire. It's not exactly the boundaries of Germany today, but it kind of is. You can see that it was a complete disaster and mess. The 30 Years' War weakened the Holy Roman Empire. And out of the Holy Roman Empire are going to spring two political entities, a place called Prussia. That's not the same as Russia. Prussia over here. And a place called Austria. And those are two pieces of the Holy Roman Empire that are German-speaking that are going to slowly evolve. And I kind of wrote that right up here at the very top. New countries are born out of the Holy Roman Empire. Over time, Austria and Prussia, with a P, become their own thing, right? Their own states, their own political entities. And what's going to happen from 1648 until World War I is going to be this Europeans striving to balance the power of other countries. So what's going to happen is if France starts to get too powerful, everybody's going to gang up on France and try to put it back in check. If Russia starts to become too powerful, then even if people who liked Russia are going to team up together to kind of keep Russia in check. And so no European country wants the others to become too powerful. And so they're going to try to balance the power in Europe. The key players are going to be Spain. At first, Spain's going to start to lose power in the 1600s, and by the 1700s, it's going to wane out, and by the 1800s, it's going to be a nothing. Okay, it's still a country, but it's not going to be a powerhouse. Whereas England and France are not the most powerful right now in the 1600s, but they're going to become the most dominant countries in Europe. Again, Russia at this point is not a powerhouse, but by the end of the 1800s is going to be a powerhouse. There's not even Germany on the map right now, but it's going to be born out of the Holy Roman Empire with the name of Prussia. So Germany equals Prussia back then, okay? Remember, that's not Russia with an R, that's this. This is Prussia with a P, and it's going to be born out of the remains of the Holy Roman Empire. So the Holy Roman Empire still exists in 1648. In fact, the Holy Roman Empire is weakened by the 30 Years' War, but it's not until Napoleon in 1815 where it totally dissolves. Okay? So we're going to talk about this concept of balance of power a lot. Let's focus on France for just a little while. France, the Kingdom of France. And where we last left off a couple weeks ago when we were talking in Unit 2 about the Reformation, we were talking about the French Wars of Religion. And as we talked about the French Wars of Religion in the second half of the 1500s, or I could say the second half of the 16th century, the Reformation rocked France. France is a Catholic country, but there was a large number of Protestants known as Huguenots. Remember this? John Calvin had a major influence in French people kind of breaking away from Catholicism. And so there was this religious conflict. It was also a political struggle to see who was going to be the king of France, the rightful ruling family of France. The Guise and the Valois, they kind of lose out to a family known as the Bourbon. And Henry IV won the French Wars of Religion. He was a Huguenot. He was a Protestant, but he knew that France was a predominantly Catholic country. And so if you remember, he converted to Catholicism because he said Paris is worth a mass. And this is all ending at the end of the 1500s. And remember, Henry IV, he invokes this petition called the Edict of Nantes. France, Nantes, right? The Edict of Nantes. And he says that we're going to respect Protestants. Because he was Protestant, but he did convert to Catholicism. But he also wanted to make sure Protestants were looked out for. But he was assassinated, okay? Just a few years after the French Wars of Religion closed, he's assassinated. So if you remember, that's kind of where we picked the story up of France in this class. And what's going to happen is after Henry IV, we're going to get a king named Louis the 13th. Now, obviously, before this class started, there were other Louis, right? 12 of them. But Louis the 13th is going to be really one of the first French kings that we're going to talk about in this class. He was about 9 years old when he becomes king. And obviously, a 9-year-old can't run a country. So oftentimes, one of the mom, even though she's not in line to become queen, she's a queen regent, she can act in the king's behalf until he's old enough. But there was also a Catholic cardinal named Richelieu. And when I say cardinal, that's not his first name. That's a position in the Catholic Church. Like there's the Pope at the top, and then there's a college of cardinals, a group of like bishops that kind of run the Catholic Church. Below the cardinals, you have archbishops and bishops, and then you get the local priests. And below that, you might have the nuns and the monks who work in the monasteries and stuff, okay, at the bottom of the hierarchy. So this is Cardinal Richelieu, and he was appointed by the Catholic Church to work in France. But it turns out that Richelieu was more interested in looking out for the rights of France than for the Catholic Church, even though he was Catholic. And so he's going to be what we call a politique. That is somebody who looks out for the benefit of their country above their own interests. So even though he works for the Catholic Church, it turns out that he's looking out for the best interest of France. And he kind of acts kind of like the king. Louis the 13th was not the most strong, awesome, stylish, great king. Cardinal Richelieu, in a lot of ways, was kind of running the country. And Cardinal Richelieu was sly. He was really good at politics. And he consolidated power into the monarchy, which he worked directly as a minister for the monarchy. And so Cardinal Richelieu might have done more to consolidate power in France than any king before him. He's one of the reasons why France is going to have absolute monarchs, okay? He basically ran France and consolidated power. And remember, when you hear Richelieu, he worked for Louis the 13th, and he was definitely a politique, somebody who looked out for the interests of France above the interests of the Catholic Church or whatever else you were interested in. One example of this, and what I'm trying to do in this class is teach you to make a claim and then to back it up with evidence. During the 30 Years' War, Cardinal Richelieu paid Protestants from Sweden to attack Habsburg Catholics in the Holy Roman Empire. A Catholic cardinal hiring Protestant armies to fight Catholics in Germany, or the old Holy Roman Empire, during the 30 Years' War. So you can see he wanted to weaken the power of the Habsburg family in the Holy Roman Empire and increase the power of France. Okay. Once Louis the 13th is out and dies, we get Louis the 14th. And I need you to highlight Louis the 14th. He is the best example of an absolute monarch in all of Europe. He was just about 5 years old when he came to the throne. I kind of laugh because obviously a 5-year-old cannot run a country. So again, we have another cardinal named Cardinal Mazarin, who kind of runs the country for him until he's old enough, along with his mother, Queen Regent. Okay, and again, sometimes people think that king and queen are like on the same level as far as power of monarchy, and that's not true. It's always within a family line. So if your father was king, so boom, then you would be the next king. But if you marry somebody, okay, she doesn't become the queen when you die. Your son does, if that kind of makes sense. So Louis the 14th was one of the most powerful leaders in all of Europe and the longest ruling monarch, okay? He ruled for over 72 years. He fought tons of wars, okay? And of course, Cardinal Mazarin kind of ran France while he was a kid until he came of age, and he was able to take the reins himself. He is the absolute best example of an absolute monarch. Louis XIV used his palace. In French, they would refer to it as a chateau, right? That's a palace in French. His chateau was called Versailles, and he used this to show off his absolute power and to show off his wealth, okay? And he also used this to distract the other nobles of France. When he was a young boy, and he wasn't really kind of running the country, but Cardinal Mazarin was, the nobles of France actually rebelled against the monarchy, and it was almost like a civil war in France called the Fronde. And during this Fronde, Louis XIV saw these nobles were trying to take power away from him, and his family had the king. And so Louis XIV, when he became king, instead of punishing the nobles, he actually tried something kind of sly. He would invite them to his royal palace at Versailles. If you've never heard of Versailles, it is probably the most famous palace in the world. It's like one of the most gone to destinations for tourists, especially in France. It's got a place called the Hall of Mirrors. Maybe you've heard of that before. It has over 1,000 fountains on the grounds. It is, I don't even know how many acres it is. I'd have to go Google it. I know that when I took my family there a couple years ago, people were renting golf carts to drive around the grounds because it would take you hours and hours to just walk the grounds. It was so huge. The king had his own palace, and the queen had her own palace or chateau. It was just spectacular. And so one of the things that I kind of put on here was like a little symbol of YouTube and Netflix and social media, because that's kind of what Versailles was back in the day. Obviously, they didn't have technology, but people would go to Versailles and they never wanted to leave because it was like a pleasure palace. Like there was always people hooking up, and there was always people gossiping about who was hooking up. And then there was always people who would go to these lavish parties, and you never wanted to leave because you didn't want to miss the next party. And so in a way, Louis XIV controlled the monarchies, the nobles in the Kingdom of France, because nobody ever wanted to leave, and then they wanted to be there at Versailles and be a part of this royal experience. And that's one of the ways where he was able to control and become this absolute monarch. And he used a style of art called Baroque. A lot of absolute monarchs use Baroque because it shows off their grandeur. That's a key word right there, okay? So we're going to continue to talk about Louis XIV because he is the most important of the absolute monarchs. He is known as the Sun King. And when he was a boy, Cardinal Mazarin was kind of running things because, again, he was about 5 years old when he came to power. And of course, his mother, Queen Anne, was also acting as queen regent until he came of age. This is a famous painting of Louis XIV. I know this is going to sound weirdo, but high heels were all the fashion for men. And for some random reason, he's showing off his stylish legs, which is weirdo because he's wearing tights. But I think he was trying to show off his athleticism and his manliness, even though that doesn't look manly by modern standards. Louis XIV was called the Sun King. He kind of saw himself as almost a god on the earth. And he is famous for saying, "I am France. I am the state." In French, l'état c'est moi. I am the state. He says there's no difference between the country of France and me. I am France. And France doesn't exist without me. And he believed that God gave him the authority to be king. So kind of following what we call the divine right of kings. Okay. He pushed 3 things to consolidate power, and here are these 3 things. Number 1, he said there's going to be one ruler. I'm not going to share power with the nobles. So he kept the nobles in check to centralize power, and then he gave away new noble titles called nobles of the robe. And remember that when he was younger, there was that Fronde rebellion, that like French Civil War. And so when he got older, he was going to distract the nobles and make sure they didn't have any power. He was going to be the sole power in France. Everybody knows the king is it. And the local nobles and the aristocracy, they answer to the king. That's the message he wanted to send. He also consolidated laws in France. He standardized the laws all across France. And he did not call the Estates General while he was king. That's sort of a parliament. We're going to use the word parliament a lot in this class, and that is a group of, well, it started out as a group of nobles. Today, it's a group of people who are voted into power. It's the legislative branch of government that makes the laws. And he said, no, nobody else is making the laws. I am the law. I am the law, and I'm the only ruler. And so he standardized the laws across the entire kingdom, really making people feel like they were part of France. He also said, we're not going to do any of this crap where we have different religions in our country. We're only going to be Catholic. And so he actually revokes the Edict of Nantes. And he says, France is Catholic. Okay? We're not going to do this Protestant business anymore. And so Protestants were persecuted again. And so it's almost like we went right back to what was happening during the French Wars of Religion. But instead of it being a war, they were just persecuted. And so a lot of them just left France. So you actually see some, smart Protestants who leave France and who end up go to the New World, like over to the Americas. They start setting up some colonies where they can have a little bit more religious freedom. And they're going to also leave to places like the Dutch Republic or the Dutch areas. Maybe even some of them escape over to England because there's a little bit more religious freedom in England, although when I talk in a few minutes, you'll see it wasn't very much better there at this point, okay? So he says that we're only going to have one faith, one law, one ruler, and interestingly enough, though, he does respect the Catholic Church, so you might want to say, well, he's kind of sharing power with the Pope, but if you see how powerful the cardinals are in France, they're looking out for the interest of France more than the Catholic Church, so it works. Okay, the king is there. I think this is really interesting. There was a giant chunk of North America that was named after Louis XIV. In fact, one of the states in the United States is still named after Louis XIV. And if you've ever been down to like New Orleans, which Orléans is a city in France, so New Orleans is named after a city in France, and Baton Rouge, right? All kinds of French. If you go to New Orleans, there's like the center of town is called the French Quarter. Anyways, Louisiana is clearly named after Louis XIV. And in fact, the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, bought the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon. So that's going to happen a little bit later after Louis XIV. But yeah, that's really significant. We have a state in the United States named after Louis XIV. Okay. One of the things that happens during Louis XIV's reign, this is just one example of the many wars that he conducted across the continent of Europe, was the War of Spanish Succession. And the King of Spain had died without an heir. And in his will, he gave the crown to the French Prince Philippe Anjou, who was the grandson of Louis XIV. And if France ruled Spain, because everybody knew if the grandson of Louis XIV becomes the king of Spain, then obviously Louis XIV is really going to become the one who runs Spain. And everybody said that's too much. So this is one example. The other monarchs in Europe see this as a major blow to the balance of power. And so they all ganged up on Louis XIV to make sure that he could not control Spain and France. That would be too much for one king to have. And so Louis XIV conducts wars all across Europe. In the end, one of the concessions at the end of the War of Spanish Succession, which ended with a treaty that was actually signed in the Dutch city of Utrecht. They actually signed this treaty to say no king of France can also be the king of Spain, was basically what it was. And then the Bourbon family does get to rule in Spain. So it kind of was not like a one-sided war. Okay, none of these wars of succession ever end easy. You know, it's always complicated. Now we're going to pause. Now we just focused on how we get to see absolute monarchs developing in France. Now we're going to spend some time talking about how new monarchs in England become absolute monarchs in England, but then how it transitions into constitutionalism. So I'm going to go way back in history because all Englishmen do this. The English nobility, like the head monarchs in England, always go back to William the Conqueror. And this happened way back in medieval times, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. But there was a Frenchman, a guy from France. Like if you go to modern day France, there's a part of France called Normandy. And there was this monarch, okay, named William the Bastard. And he decided, since he didn't have a big kingdom in the area that's France today, he was going to go across the English Channel and conquer England. And his name was William. And people remember him as William the Conqueror. And he defeats all the other rivals in England. And in 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, becomes the King of England. And he is remembered as the beginning, really. Now, there was kings before, but this is where the modern lines all trace their lineage to, is William the Conqueror. All British monarchs trace their lines back to William the Conqueror, back in 1066. Now, our class starts in 1450, so there's obviously lots of kings from William the Conqueror until this class starts. This class starts at the end of the 100 Years' War in the 1450s. The 100 Years' War was an epic battle between the French and the English for who was the rightful king of France. And you might say, well, obviously the French people are the rightful heirs to the throne of France, but that's not true because actually it was a French dude, William, who crossed over into England and conquered England. And so a couple hundred years later, the kings of England can say, we're actually from France. I mean, our lineage, we have rights to the kingdom of France as much as any Frenchman does. So that's what the 100 Years' War was, one of the biggest, longest, most drawn out, ugliest conflicts in medieval times, from the middle of the 1300s to the middle of the 1400s. It was France versus England. It took place mostly in France to see who was the rightful king of France. And remember, at the end of the 100 Years' War, we get that hero. It's really unique in history to see a woman who steps up and becomes such a military hero, Joan of Arc. So it's a cool experience right there. Think of Joan of Arc. She helps the French win. And by win, I mean they kick the English out of France, except for a small little port city called Calais. Okay? After the 100 Years' War ended, so when this class starts in the 1450s, it's the end of the 100 Years' War. And after the 100 Years' War ended, the British go back to England, okay? And they start to have their own internal conflict over which royal family should inherit the kingdom. So they just spent 100 years fighting in France, generations fighting in France. And that doesn't mean there was a battle every single day for 100 years. It means just over the course of 100 years, there was constant battles and this giant war being fought. And after that's done, the English go back home and they start duking it out over who's the rightful English king now. So many people have died. People refer to this as the War of the Roses. So after the 100 Years' War, the English go back home. And you can see right after the 100 Years' War, they have this internal sort of civil war between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. And both the House of Lancaster and the House of York have a rose on their royal crest, and that's why they call it the War of the Roses. And William Shakespeare wrote a whole bunch of plays about all the intrigue and the diabolical schemes that happen as royal families are killing each other off in this War of the Roses. Sometimes it was actual battles, and sometimes it was more like assassination or murder, or some uncle taking his little nephews and hiding them in a tower and killing them off so that he could be the next king. It gets pretty bloody, and it's kind of one of those stories that's epic. And tons of movies and plays have been based on the War of the Roses. But in the end of the War of the Roses, a guy named Henry Tudor becomes the winner. He defeats Richard III in a battle, and he becomes King of England. And he renames himself Henry VII. Okay? This is Henry Tudor. And so what we're going to talk about from now on, right now, is the Tudor dynasty. That is the family members from the Tudor family that are the kings of England. So he wins the war, and he starts a new dynasty, the Tudor dynasty. He calls himself Henry VII. And in order to centralize power and to make sure that nobody, is stabbing him in the back, either metaphorically or literally, he creates what's called the Star Chamber, which is a court where he can control the nobles. Because oftentimes in English history, the nobles ran their own courts. So if a noble does something illegal, but they're in control of the courts, then they can get away with it. So the Star Court was designed to consolidate power. And this is where we start to see the new monarchs develop. And that's the title right here. Tudor, Henry Tudor, is really the first new monarch. His son goes even a step further. His son is somebody that we already talked about in this class. His son is Henry VIII. He's the king that's famous. Maybe you remember this from our previous notes where I said his divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. That's what happened to the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Remember, this is the guy who wanted to divorce his first wife. And so the Pope wouldn't give him an annulment or a divorce. And so he divorces his country from the Catholic Church and creates his own church so he can give himself a divorce. That's the simple version. And he marries another woman named Anne Boleyn, and he kind of gets tired of her, and she's charged with treachery and infidelity, and so her head is chopped off, and he gets his third wife, and she gives him a son, but dies in childbirth. Okay, so all kinds of things that are happening. We're going to go through some of the kids of Henry VIII. But he actually separates his country from the control of Rome or the Pope. And so this really consolidates his power. And some people might say he was a new monarch consolidating power. And some people might say, nah, he was an absolute monarch. He controlled the religion and the politics. And he used that star chamber like his father before him to make sure that nobody was going against him. And if you messed with Henry VIII, you got your head chopped off, even if you were married to the guy. Even like Sir Thomas More, the famous writer, got his head chopped off because he refused to break with Catholicism and said the king shouldn't break with the Catholic Church, so got his head chopped off. Now, Henry VIII does have a son from his third wife. Remember, divorced, beheaded, died in childbirth. Then divorced, beheaded, survived. His last wife does survive, lives longer than he does. But after he finally dies, going through 6 wives, his son reigns for like 5 years, but he's a little kid. He's like an early teenager. So he's not very powerful, and I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time just because of the time we have. But Edward VI does rule. He's the king. He's the king's son. But because he dies so quickly, actually, Henry VIII's oldest daughter becomes queen. So I actually have some great little videos that I put in here to kind of help you understand about how England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland make up the United Kingdom, okay? As we talk about the conflict in England, it's going to lead to civil war. And so Bloody Mary, maybe you guys have heard of Bloody Mary. She's a real woman. She was the daughter of Henry VIII from his first wife, who he divorced. So she grew up Catholic. And Henry VIII, of course, he was a Protestant, right? He separated his church from the Catholic Church. He made his own church, the Church of England. So he was Protestant, but his daughter was Catholic. And so when she becomes queen, she wants to return England to Catholicism. And anybody who opposes her, burns at the stake. And so she's known as Bloody Mary. She's the daughter of Henry VIII. Her mother was divorced from her father because he wanted to marry another girl that he was already sleeping with, Anne Boleyn. Okay? She married the King of Spain. And remember, Spain is a Catholic country, so you kind of get a feel. And of course, after she dies, the King of Spain feels like England should be his territory, so he actually tries to invade. But Mary's sister from Henry VIII's second wife, see how complicated this can get. So Mary's half-sister, same dad, Henry VIII, but different moms, okay? Elizabeth's mom had her head chopped off. Remember, divorced, beheaded, died. Then divorced, beheaded, survived. So this is, Elizabeth is from the second wife, and she's actually one of the most kick-butt queens of England. And she kind of settles things down and brings stability to the country. And she kind of restores the Protestantism that her father kind of initiated with her mom. And she is also the one who stops the King of Spain invading. So there's this giant bunch of ships called the Spanish Armada that tried to invade England, and Queen Elizabeth helps protect it. This is during the time period of, like, say, William Shakespeare. Some people call it the Elizabethan era. We actually, now this is weird, we actually have a state in our country that is named after Queen Elizabeth. The state of Virginia. This is no joke. Queen Elizabeth is known as the Virgin Queen. And she's called the Virgin Queen because she never married and never had children. Okay? And so this is going to cause another problem. If you're the king or queen and you don't have any posterity, any kids, then that's going to cause a serious issue, because that's how kingdoms are passed around. From king to son, from king to son, etc. Now, in this case, this is ironic because 2 daughters in a row become the queens of England, and that kind of sets a precedence about having not just kings, but also queens who rule. So Queen Elizabeth, known as the Virgin Queen, and I guess you could tell the state of Virginia is named after her, and she helps restore order, and she's known as one of the greatest monarchs in European history. But she doesn't have any kids. And so she decides to pass on power to a cousin. And she was going to give it to her cousin, who was known as Mary, Queen of Scots. That's different than Bloody Mary. She had a cousin named Mary. But Mary, Queen of the Scots, was involved in an assassination attempt on her life. And so actually Elizabeth did have her head chopped off. But she does promise to give the kingdom to Mary, Queen of Scots' son, James. But this is a different family, and so we're going to leave the Tudors behind and move over to the Stuart family from Scotland. The Stuart family from Scotland is going to replace the Tudors. James is probably most famous for a settlement in Virginia called Jamestown. It's the first permanent English settlement in the 13 colonies, Jamestown in Virginia, right? Virginia is one of the most important of the 13 original states. James also decided that he wanted to have the Bible published in English. Before, some people were killed for doing that, but James said, I want regular people to have access to the Bible. And so he put together a huge group of scholars who worked diligently on translating it from the original Hebrew of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New Testament, instead of using the Latin version that the Catholic Church used. And he published the most widely used version of the Bible in English, the King James Version. Okay. Again, his mother was Mary, Queen of Scots, and she doesn't become the queen. She gets her head chopped off by Elizabeth because she was trying to assassinate her. But anyways, this starts the Stuart line in English history. Now, the Stuarts from Scotland are controlling now the crown of England, which kind of marries England and Scotland into the same royal line. This is where we start to go from two separate kingdoms, which they kind of still are today, two different countries, but their royal families are going to merge here. So the Queen or the King of England is also going to be the King or Queen of Scotland. And the Stuarts kind of favor Catholicism. So now we're kind of going back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism, and that's going to lead to a civil war. So James I, when he's dead, Charles I is going to become king. And he has a huge and serious conflict with Parliament. And it's disastrously complicated. But remember, Parliament is the legislative branch of government in England. And there's still a lot of religious tension. And there's going to be some people who side with Parliament and some people who side with the king. And we're going to end up in the English Civil War. Look at the dates. This is right during the middle of the 30 Years' War. So some of the troops that were actually fighting on the continent in the 30 Years' War leave and go back to fight in the English Civil War. Basically, it's Parliament and their army versus the king and his army, and it's way more complicated than that, but you'll read about it in the textbook. Parliament armies are led by a guy named Oliver Cromwell, and there's lots of other leaders and names, but I'm trying to simplify it for the point of these notes. Parliament's army was led by Oliver Cromwell, and soldiers in his army were called the Roundheads. Okay, the Roundheads. And the soldiers in the army that were loyal to the king were known as Cavaliers. So Cavaliers and Roundheads. And they duke it out in bloody battles all across England. And it's all to see who's going to walk away with the power, Parliament or the king. And if you don't know the end of the story, I'll repeat again what I said at the beginning. If you go to the United Kingdom today, who really runs the country? Parliament does. We still have a Queen of England, but Parliament really makes the laws and runs the government, even though there still is a royal family. So who's going to win? Parliament. Parliament wins, and Charles I is executed. The English Parliament, that's the nobles of England, chop off the king's head. If you haven't been paying attention, there's a lot of head chopping off going on, okay? So Charles I is executed, and England becomes a de facto republic where it's not run by a king or a queen, but it's run by Oliver Cromwell for about 11 years. Oliver Cromwell turns out to be more nasty and mean than any king or queen would have been. And so the people end up rejecting Oliver Cromwell, and they're going to restore the monarchy. So this is just a little painting of the Spanish Armada. That was when Philip and his wife died, Bloody Mary, and Bloody Mary's half-sister Elizabeth takes over, and the King of Spain feels like England is his, and so he tries to invade. Okay, a really famous piece of English history. This, of course, is a painting of the English Civil War, where troops who were fighting in the 30 Years' War on the continent in Germany, Holy Roman Empire, come home and fight in the English Civil War. Troops are withdrawn, and we duke it out in this giant epic. Now, so after the king gets his head chopped off and Oliver Cromwell is trying to run the country, the people, the parliament of England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland, the United Kingdom, it's not quite official yet, but the monarchy is the same. So there is no monarchy, but the people feel like the best way to restore order is to restore the rightful heirs to the throne. And so they restore the Stuart family. Remember, it was Charles I who got his head chopped off, right? Charles I loses to Parliament and gets his head chopped off. Okay? And so they're going to restore the Stuart family to the monarchy. Okay? This is Charles II. He is one of the more loved kings. I mean, if the king before you got his head chopped off, you better be better than that. And so he doesn't have conflict with Parliament. He's pretty chill. He's sometimes called the Merry Monarch. Everybody loved him but his wife, I think. That's because he cheated on her like all the time. He don't quote me on this number, but some like 10 or 12 bastard kids with other women. I mean, he was not faithful to his wife, but the people of England liked him because he wasn't overly harsh. And again, he's called the Merry Monarch, not causing any trouble. Okay, so generally, Charles II is very much liked, but the next king, James II, is hated so much. So remember, it's going to go. This is the point where we might want to just pause for a second. I've just taken you through English kings. I started with Henry Tudor, who is Henry VII, followed by Henry VIII, the Pig King, who chopped off his wife's heads. And then we get his son, Edward VI, who rules for a short time, and then Bloody Mary, and then Elizabeth I, who's pretty cool and kick butt. She doesn't have any kids, so that's when we get James I, and then Charles I, who gets his head chopped off, and then Charles II, who's the Merry Monarch, and in between those, we have the English Civil War and Cromwell. Okay, and then we're going to end with James II. And James II is so unpopular that Parliament says we need to have a fresh start. We need to reboot the monarchy. We need to have a revolution and just start off fresh. We need to wipe the slate clean and reboot the monarchy. And so they actually go to the Netherlands. Parliament invites a Dutch guy and his wife, William and Mary. So there's William and Mary, and they invite them to be the monarchs of England and Scotland. I mean, it's going to become the United Kingdom eventually right here. And so they invite this guy from the Netherlands. His name is William of Orange. Orange is like his royal lands in the Dutch area. And so William and Mary are invited into England, and Parliament says, if you come and take over, we won't stop you. There'll be no armies. James II, he might try to stop you, but we're not going to. And we're pretty sure that if you show up with a giant army and just take England, nobody's going to stop you because James II, he's a wuss. He's going to run away. So William and Mary land in England. The year is 1688. This is a date you want to highlight, circle, put stars around. This is called the Glorious Revolution. It's generally seen as a bloodless revolution. There was tons of blood before, and there'll be some fighting afterwards. But when William and Mary show up in England, nobody stops them. James runs away, and it's a bloodless change of power. It's a watershed event, if you will. the Glorious Revolution, everything from here on is going to become good. Now, that's an oversimplification, but if you look at English history, stability, success, strong economy, England's going to become the leader of the world, and we're going to trace it back to this Glorious Revolution. If you've been paying attention in this class today, then you know that there was serious conflict in England before this time, lots of heads being chopped off and civil war. But after this time, things are going to become stable and move forward, and England's going to become like this, I guess, light to the rest of the world, and it's going to take over the rest of the world. Doesn't mean they don't have their problems, but the Glorious Revolution is a singularly important thing. And look at this. Within the year, Parliament passes what they call the English Bill of Rights. In our country, in the United States, the Bill of Rights is one of the most important things. And so the English write a Bill of Rights before we were even conceived of as a country. And it's kind of like a constitution that limits the power of king. I want to remind you what I just said. It was Parliament that invites William of Orange to become the new king when they reboot the monarchy in the Glorious Revolution. And so, if I can say this clearly, who's in power from this point on? The king is not in power, Parliament is. And so this is what we start to see, the beginning of a constitutional monarchy. A few years after this, they create what they call the Act of Union in 1707, where they actually create the United Kingdom of Great Britain with Parliament in control. And that's where we go from it just being England or Scotland or Wales or Ireland to becoming the United Kingdom. And understanding the history of the United Kingdom helps us see the transition from absolute monarchs, like the Stuarts, like James I and Charles I. Those were absolute monarchs. And when Charles I gets his head chopped off and they try to go republic for a while, it doesn't work because Cromwell sucks. Then you're going to get Charles II and James II who try to become absolute monarchs again. And they can't because Parliament won the Civil War. And so by the time we get William of Orange, who becomes William III, remember it was William and Mary, his wife, who was, of course, from England. And we reboot the monarchy, we get stability, and we get success in English history. So this is a little reminder of the flags. This is the actual flag of England, and this is the flag of Scotland, and this was the flag of the Kingdom of Ireland. And when you combined those together, you get the United Kingdom. It's called the Union Jack. So if you're wondering why it looks like that, they took the kingdoms, England, Scotland, Ireland, and put them together, and that's the United Kingdom flag. The only one that's not on there is the Kingdom of Wales, and I guess it just didn't quite go with the whole motif. I think it would actually kind of cool to have a dragon in the middle, but anyways, the Kingdom of Wales kind of got left off of the Union Jack, unfortunately. Here's a little video on the Union Jack. The reason we care so much about this constitutionalism, going from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, is because of how much England controls the world by the end of the story. At one point, the English control about a fourth of the world's population and landmass. And if you just take a look on this, it's on every continent, places where people speak English. Of course, they even controlled the 13 colonies for a while. But they're going to lose the 13 colonies. But we still speak English, so you can see the impact. During the English Civil War, one of the most famous writers was Thomas Hobbes. He wrote a book called Leviathan, where he talked about how nasty and brutish human beings were because he saw people killing each other. And he believed that you needed a strong monarch. He believed in an absolute monarchy. He did not believe in having a constitution because his world was falling apart. So he thought that an absolute monarchy would help people keep a social contract and keep people from killing each other. So later, people during the Enlightenment of the 1700s are going to use some of Thomas Hobbes' ideas and play off of those. But he was one of those guys who wrote during this time. And actually, there's another one that we're going to have to talk about later called John Locke, who wrote during the Glorious Revolution. And all of Locke's ideas are going to be used by Thomas Jefferson to support constitutionalism. So Locke and Hobbes are kind of in opposite sides of the corner, but we're going to talk about Locke later. Okay. Again, we're trying to help you see what Europe looked like back in the 1600s when we're talking about. So what shaped modern political development? That's a huge topic that we need to finish off with. The end of the 30 Years' War in 1648 is seen as a pivotal time because secular authority, that is not church authority, okay, starts to become superior to religious authority. And we start to see that break between church and state. The ideas of the modern nation state system is born out of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, right? The Peace of Westphalia is a set of treaties. And there was a Dutch guy, Hugo Grotius, who really kind of helped compile international law for the first time. Monarchs throughout history often claimed that their power was based on the divine right of kings. Remember Machiavelli back from the Renaissance? Machiavelli said this is smart. He said, if you're the king of a Christian country, whether you're really Christian or not, you better play that part. Because if you can convince people that God gave you power and that you are the rightful mouthpiece of Christ on earth, then people will do whatever you say if they're really Christians. He said, that's smart politics. He said, if you were the king of a Buddhist country, you should play the part of a Buddhist. Because anybody who really believes in Buddhism would support you. So he says it doesn't matter. If the people are religious, then play that part. He says, I don't care if you really are, just play that part. Remember, Machiavelli was a political writer during the Italian Renaissance, okay? So I just kind of brought him up to kind of show you how that power play works out. Divine right is the idea that the ruler power comes directly from God, right? Like people, absolute monarchs, like Louis XIV in France would have used this to say, God made me king. So again, the Renaissance and the Reformation, those are the two topics before this one, changed some of the ideas about government and how rulers got their power, leading to these new monarchies during the 14 and 1500s, or 15th and 16th century. So again, I've embedded videos that I would use in class to tie off with. Just a couple of last thoughts so you kind of see where this all sprung from. Monarchs and kingdoms in Western Europe would always look back to old Roman laws. Remember, everybody looks back to Greek and Roman heritage for their culture and their language. And so the idea of Rome lives way beyond the actual fall of Rome. Please remember also that all European culture has been integrated by Germanics. The Germanic culture and the Germanic tribes that conquered the old Roman Empire, they laid down Germanic laws on top of the old Roman system, and that's what created the whole idea of medieval Europe. And the one thing that tied all of Europe together during the Middle Ages, of course, was Christianity. Because Rome adopted Christianity as its official religion, and then it split. Rome split and fell apart. That's why we get the early split between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. But we also get a unifying factor. So it's weird. It's kind of like it unites all Europeans in a common cause, but it also creates this huge divide. And so those are kind of the three things. And kings would change their name when they come to power. And that's where a lot of people struggle with the like Louis XIV, and they see the X and the I and the V, and they don't know how to read Latin or Roman numbers. That's what those Roman numerals, they call them. It gets kind of tricky for kids, especially because there's so many like James the First and Charles the First and Charles the Second and James the Second, right? You get all these numbers in there like Henry the Seventh and then Henry the Eighth, and that gets really tricky to people. But if you actually look at the order of kings, when you become king, you get to pick a regal name, just like the Pope gets to pick a spiritual name. And if you like the name Henry, then you have to pick the number after whoever was the Henry before you, right? If there was 6 Henrys already, then you got to be Henry the Seventh. And so that's how it kind of works off. So the building blocks of European society, 3 trends that help medieval style government evolve into the modern form of government we have today. Number 1 is the transition from a decentralized power and authority of government towards a centralized power. That's a major theme we talked about today. And number two, from a political elite consisting primarily of hereditary landed nobility, so you had to be royal to have power, towards one that is open to men distinguished by their education, skills, and wealth. And of course, number three is transitioning away from religious conflict and power to secular laws and justice. And so we see these things coming together, and that's going to be the end of our notes. I did already talk about like hierarchy and church authority, and we also kind of talked already about lords and nobles and peasants and serfs at the bottom. So I feel like we've already covered that in our notes today. At the end of my video, there's always some great resources if you're still struggling with the concepts talked about in here. But we'll go ahead and end our week 8 notes. Thanks for being with us.